Now.
Good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. So today I'm going to talk about gender segregation. And what I mean about that is the observed pattern that in many labor markets, men and women seem to be in different jobs and sectors. More specifically, I'm going to talk about a mechanism that I propose that might help to explain the persistence of gender segregation over time. So there are many potential explanations to segregation in the labor market. So for example, discrimination, gender differences in preferences, norms and gender identity, or the desire to work with others of the same gender, or being assigned with a majority in the workplace. So what I do in this paper is to have the premise that there's some uncertainty about job characteristics. What this means is that you might be able to observe wages and some of the tasks in different jobs. But for example, the stress level, competitiveness, social environment and stuff like that is more difficult to observe. And what I go through or what I explore in this paper is a mechanism or a strategy to try to resolve this uncertainty about job characteristics that people might use. So the basic argument is that if men and women perceive preferences as gender dependent, they might ascribe informational value to segregation. And I show in my model that under some assumptions, this inference about unobservable job characteristics will prescribe different job choices for the majority of men and women, thus leading to the reproduction of segregation. So if this extends to the labor market, or for that matter in my experiment, there are two implications that can rationalize or help to rationalize the persistence of segregation. There will be choice externalities. So if people base their choices based on the current extent of segregation, gender segregation in the market, then people will maximize their own utility when choosing job, but they will at the same time add to the information base that subsequent decision makers make their choices on. And secondly, the endurance of perceptions of differences in preferences could uphold segregation. So if people base their job, again, if people base their job choices based on segregation and not the actual unobservable characteristics, these unobservable characteristics might change, but segregation will not respond to this. So this paper is connected to different literatures. Of course, the literature on gender segregation in the labor market, but also a literature on observational learning. And this literature basically studies how one can infer the information of others based on observing their actions. So I'm not going to go that detailed into the literature for the sake of time. Let's just jump straight into my argument. So in this stylized model, there are two jobs, A and B, with some unobservable characteristics, JA and JB. And there's a DM, a decision maker, that chooses A if the distance between JA and his bliss point is smaller than the distance between JB and his bliss point. And his bliss point is basically just his preferred value of J. So J is just a dimension where these JA and JB are located somewhere. He observes the current market and segregation in the current market, and believes that the ones who are in the market have made their choices based on some information about the location of JA and JB. And I denote the distribution of men and women over jobs as WA, WB, MA, MB, where WA is the fraction of women choosing job A, and MA the fraction of men choosing job A. Finally, the DM has some beliefs about the distribution of bliss points. So here you can see the cumulative distributions, capital FV, that's the distribution of women's bliss points, and capital FM, the distribution of men's bliss points. And in this example, the distribution of women stochastically dominates the distribution of men. So this figure is just an illustration of how these beliefs about the distribution of preferences might look for the DM. So on the left side, you have the probability density distribution of women's bliss points, and on the right side, the probability density distribution of men's bliss points. So upon observing, for instance, that the share of women in job A is larger than the share of men choosing job A, the DM will infer that the share of women choosing job A corresponds to the area under the curve, if you see my arrow. So the area under the curve of women's probability density distribution of bliss points up until this value J bar. Okay, and you can find this value J bar by solving the equation at the top here. So what this value this J bar is going to tell the DM is the value of J at which an individual would be indifferent between choosing between job A and job B. So the DM cannot fully or cannot find out where JA and JB are located specifically on this line, but rather say in which sets they are. So if, for example, the DM has a bliss point which is lower than J bar, it's going to choose A because JA is located somewhere to the left of J bar. And if it has a bliss point to the right, it's going to choose JB. Now, let's suppose that we sample lots of men and women from these two distributions, and let them show let them choose job in an equal environment. So the first prediction is that if there are more women choosing A than men, then segregation will reproduce itself. So since we draw from these distributions, we will have approximately capital F, W, J bar women born or drawn from this distribution that chooses A, and the rest will choose B. And we have the mirrored image for men. So here we have that a small fraction of men, the minority of men, will choose A because they are the ones drawn from the left side of J bar here. So since they make their choices based on their bliss points, men and women choosing A, job A will have lower bliss points than men and women choosing B. So obviously the men and women choosing A will have bliss points to the left of J bar, and men and women choosing B will have bliss points to the right. So they will differ. So then prediction 3, this actually, yeah, it's a seldom feature of the labor market, I would say, but it helps in kind of identifying the reasoning of the model in the experiment that I'm going to show you. So if subjects only observe the distribution of their own gender over jobs, the J bar is going to be ambiguous. So this illustrates what I mean. So upon arriving in the labor market and observing that a fraction of MA are already in A, this fraction corresponds both to a fraction of men in the left tail, but also in the right tail of the distribution. So the men that are going to choose jobs are uncertain about whether the men choosing A are the ones with really low values on J or the ones with really high values on J. So everyone between these two values are of course going to choose job B, so the one that's dominated by men. Well, these in the tails have to calculate their expected utility of choosing A relative to B. And if we are agnostic about how JA and JB are located on this dimension J, segregation will be even larger compared to the case in which the DMs observe the distributions of both men and women over jobs A and B. So the intuition for this is that suppose you're a man and you're in the left tail of this distribution, you might choose to go for job A, hoping that J bar 1 is the correct divider between J and JB. However, there's a possibility that J bar 2 is the correct one, and JA could be located far to the right on J, and far away from your bliss point. So then it's safer to go for job B, which is dominated by men. Okay, so I do an experiment to test these predictions, and it's conducted on Prolific, which is an online platform. 400 men and women from the US participated in the experiment, and the science simulations and codes were uploaded in the AEA RCT registry. It consists of two parts, this experiment. So in part one, a group of subjects are presented with descriptions of two jobs that they're going to choose between, where a job is a set of questions or a task to complete. Job descriptions include general information about the jobs, including topic, payment, structure, and the degree of risk in determining their payment. After choosing a job, subjects perform the job they chose, and this is repeated 7 times more. I also have 2 groups of men and women participating in part 1, which gives me a total of 2 times 8 job pairs with different gender compositions. So the reason why I have so many job pairs is, of course, to have some job pairs that are more or less gender balanced, and some job pairs that are more gender segregated. In part 2, subjects are first told about part 1. So they're told that subjects in part 1 chose between 2 jobs, and that they were told what these jobs were about. They're also informed that they would not know the characteristics of the jobs, but that they might differ in terms of topic, payment structure, and the degree of risk in determining their payment. They would also observe some summary statistics regarding the previous group participating in part 1. So the fraction of men and women choosing A and B, and the average age in each job, and the share of parents in each job. So I included these to not make it too obvious that this was about gender. Then I implemented the between subjects treatment, segregation and equality treatment, where subjects in the equality treatment observed a gender balanced market, where the distribution of men and women over jobs A and B were uniformly distributed. In the segregation treatment, it was not uniformly distributed. A larger share of men chose A, and a relatively larger share of women chose job B. As you can see, these other characteristics, fraction was kids, and average age differ between the treatments. So this might of course bias the results, but I'm going to argue that this effect is negligible, that it doesn't matter that much. To test the prediction 3, so this was about segregation being larger when they only observe the distribution of their own gender over jobs A and B. I implement a new between subject treatment. So in the unit treatment, so this is what men were shown. In the unit treatment, I showed men, only the share of men choosing job A and job B, and in the dual treatment, they observed both. So also women's distribution over jobs. And women, of course, they observed the distribution of women over A and B in the unit treatment. Finally, at the end, I elicited their preferences and beliefs on some dimensions. So what I'm going to show you today is about risk. So I asked them in general, how willing are you to take risks? And I also elicited their beliefs about what they thought the average American man and women would have on this 10-point Likert scale. So on this 10-point Likert scale, 10 means that the subject is very willing to take risks. And when eliciting their beliefs, I just asked them to place the average man and woman on this 10-point Likert scale. Okay. So the hypothesis corresponds to the predictions. So the share of men and women choosing job A and B respectively is significantly larger in the segregation treatment than in the equality treatment. And the second is about differences in risk preferences between men and women choosing job A and job B. And just recall that job A is the male-dominated job, job B is the female-dominated job. And the third hypothesis regards the union dual treatment, where I expect segregation to be larger in the unit treatment, which means that the share of men and women choosing job A and B respectively, so the male and female job, female dominated job, is going to be higher in the unit treatment. So let's start with some summary statistics regarding their preferences and beliefs. So as expected, men in this experiment are more risk tolerant than women. So they have an average of 5.9 on this Likert scale, while women has an average of about 5.16. So these are the beliefs that subjects have about the average risk tolerance of men and women. And of course, it's crucial that they have more or less the same beliefs about the risk preferences in order to infer something about the model predictions from the outcomes in the data. And we see that they have quite accurate beliefs about the average risk preferences, at least when it comes to the people in the subjects in the experiment. But they exaggerate, it seems like they exaggerate the risk tolerance, average risk tolerance of men somewhat. However, both lay the foundations for finding or for being able to infer something about the model from the outcomes in the data. So result one, so it turns out that the share of women and men choosing jobs A and B, respectively, is significantly higher in the segregation treatment relative to the equality treatment. So this is a figure where it's broken down by gender, and these dark green bars are the shares of men and women choosing job B. So as you see in the equality treatment, these are quite close to the 50% dashed line, while in the segregation treatment, more women choose B, less women choose A. So it's not like it's only driven by more women choosing B and more men choosing A. Both go in opposite directions. So I told you about these other characteristics that might interfere with the results. What I do here is or what is important when it comes to the bias is that these other characteristics than gender matter differently for men and women, okay? So what I do here is running some regression on their actual choice, where the dependent variable is 1 if a subject chose job B, age is the self-reported age of a subject, male is 1 if the subject is male, and the male age is the interaction term. So as we see here, the age seems to have a compositional effect. However, however, men and women seem to do the same regardless of age, and this is quite precisely estimated at 0, this interaction term. So in order for the share of parents to be kind of the driver of this treatment effect that I showed you on the previous slide, we would expect it to have different effects on men and women. However, both men and women have more or less the same inclination to choose job B in the equality treatment. So I think at best it might have a negligible effect on my results. So let's go to prediction 2. This was about differences in preferences between men and women choosing job A and B. So on the pooled results, in the pooled sample, men and women choosing job B, the female-dominated job, are relatively more risk-averse than men and women choosing job A, the male-dominated job. And as you see here, it looks like, so this illustration, in this illustration, these are broken down by gender. As you can see, the overall pattern seems to fit both genders, even though the magnitude is smaller, definitely smaller or seems to be smaller among men. So the previous result that I showed you was kind of based on the presumption that men and women had the same beliefs about gender differences in risk preferences. But now I take them explicitly into account. So what I do here is to predict the job choice of subjects based on their risk preferences and beliefs about the risk preferences of men and women. So this dependent variable, job B, is equal to 1 if a subject chose job B, the female-dominated job, and the predict job B is equal to 1 if a subject's risk preference is closer to his or her perception of the average risk preferences of women. And it's equal to 0 otherwise. So as we can see in the segregation treatment, it seems to be a significant predictor, but not in the equality treatment. So prediction 3, I did not find support for in the data. So segregation is not larger by any means in the unit treatment than in the dual treatment. It actually goes in the opposite direction for women. So fewer women choose job B in the unit treatment than in the dual treatment. So I do not find support for this. However, there seems to be some ambiguity or only observing the distribution of their own gender seems to provide less information about how jobs differ than observing both. So here I do the same exercise as above. So I predict job choices and correlate it with actual job choices. And as you can see, you can't do it in the unit treatment, but it's a significant predictor in the dual treatment. Okay, so just some thoughts at the end. So it seems like gender composition does convey some information about unobservables. However, it's important to remember that this is really beliefs in segregation only permit correct inference if previous choices are in fact informative of relevant characteristics. So this would mean in my experiment that people in part 1 actually cared about risk. It could be that they didn't. Also, subjects would have to have correct beliefs about gender differences in preferences. So this would mean that people in part, or subjects in part 2, would have to have the correct preferences or accurate beliefs about the preferences of subjects in part 1. Of course, this may not be the case in the real world. So moreover, so I'm not going to finish up quite quickly. So of course, there's a multitude of reasons why segregation might wrongfully signal differences in unobservable job characteristics in the real labor market, preferences over observables that are also correlated with gender, other factors that inhibit voluntary choice, and other conformism concerns, of course. So these results should not be interpreted as to meaning that segregation is necessarily efficient in the market. So the experiment was highly stylized just to kind of see whether I could identify the mechanism. So to conclude, I asked the question: how do people interpret gender segregation in the labor market? And show that it could be that gender composition and beliefs allow people to make some inferences about unobservable job characteristics, whereas segregation signals that something is different between jobs that correlate with gender, and beliefs about preference heterogeneity within and between gender might enable them to infer why. So thank you very much.